All right, hey everyone. It is April what day is it? 6th, 2020. Good to be here with you. Logos at home, week number 2. This is your video lecture on Phylum Mollusca, a really remarkable group of critters. Let's go ahead and get underway. Here we go. Pardon me. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this new day, this new week. I pray this would be a blessing to these young naturalists, biologists, young adults that engage in your creation, in your special, your general revelation, your natural revelation. I pray this would be fruitful and encouraging and fun. Pray blessings on their week. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, Phylum Mollusca, here we go, guys. A thoughtful quote for you. He who is forewarned is forearmed, and he who is forearmed is half an octopus. And who wants to be that? That's from Walt Kelly. This even predates Mr. Boyd. This is kind of like your grandpa's comic strips that came in the newspaper. Famous old one called Pogo. Walt Kelly is the illustrator there, and that's from him. No one wants to be half an octopus, right? And no one really wants to be a whole octopus. They are bizarre creatures. We're going to be spending a lot of time learning about them and other creatures, and for some reason, this keeps falling off the list. There we go. Kingdom Animalia review. These are eukaryotic creatures. Of course, they're multicellular. Of course, they have these very communicative cells that lack cell walls, a very sophisticated cell membrane, smart membrane that allows for communication between cells, and also, of course, to import and export everything that needs to be produced and brought in for cell function. Of course, they're motile. We're going to get into some very sophisticated creatures here in this chapter. This is 24 in Ryan and Dance. You're reading that first. And then we'll look at echinoderms. Notice we're skipping 25. We're going to spend all of next week doing that because that's a humongous group. This is the second largest of the phyla of animals. And so here we see our logo, Mr. Molluscan himself. Snails are mollusks. A beautiful close-up shot of this snail. And two of those and they're all considered quote-unquote tentacles, two for sensing and smell and taste, those smaller ones down and kind of at the front end of the head, and then two with eyes perched on top. So a really remarkable bunch of creatures, and it's getting harder to pigeonhole these creatures. Phylum Mollusca, second only to the arthropods, and that's what we'll be spending our time on next week. So a little review of where we've been. We've learned about the sponges. We've learned about the cnidarians. We're really giving short shrift here to the worms. We're dissing the worms, as I said, on the course post this week, not because they're not important, but because we are short on time around here. And so we're adapting. And so you've gone out, or you're going out soon, and you'll be grabbing up an earthworm, and you'll be exploring, or rather investigating that earthworm a little bit, observing its features. And at least we can give a nod to the annelids, the segmented worms. It'll be obvious, and it probably already is to you, that these are segmented worms. And the nematodes and platyhelminths are also important worms that we're kind of just glossing over. A little bit more about them. I've adjusted my numbers. You might have noticed the numbers have changed a little bit from the first introduction to Kingdom Animalia slides. That's because I did a bit more research, and numbers, estimates for these species vary widely. Some of it's simply bad accounting. Some of it's there hasn't been a synthesized, a comprehensive review of all the literature for these various groups. Nematodes, folks speculate this is a very small start because they're so little. You can find millions of nematodes in just a couple of pounds of soil. Okay, so they expect there are many more species, but to date, we really only have this many that are cataloged, between 15 and 20,000. Annelids about the same, and then a little bit more for the platyhelminths, which include a very famous creature we call the planarian. And the planarian is a kind of a famous slide creature, a specimen creature that we looked at earlier this year under the microscopes. And so, just to make sure we mention briefly the three major worm phyla, because they are quite numerous and important and interesting, but we've got to keep on rolling and get here into the the matter at hand, which are the mollusks. And so we've got a bit of a jump here. Because we skipped those worm phyla, the change from Cnidaria to mollusca is going to be shocking. There are a wide variety of worms, some more complex, some simpler, and but Cnidarians and molluscans are really worlds apart regarding complexity. So you're going to see fully formed body systems here. You can look at this symmetry and immediately see that this ain't your radial symmetry. This is something that hits much closer to home. And this, of course, is bilateral symmetry. And so you can see that here. Just turn this off real quick here. If it'll let me. There we go. This is a chitin, a neat marine creature found in tide pools, found on the seafloor, typically in rocky places. And it kind of is like a one-shelled snail of sorts, except it always has these 8 horizontal bands or kind of overlapping plates. So this is a little tiny creature, a chitin. This one's found in the North Pacific Ocean, called the line chitin, about 2 inches long, a little bit less, showing beautiful color and, of course, bilateral symmetry. So the mollusks. And so I did a little more homework than necessary for this group because I was really interested in finding out how many there actually are. How many named specified species of this group are there? The mollusks, the clams, the snails, the octopods. I also did a little bit of research on the name here, and there's a lot of discussion about what's correct for the plural form of the octopus. Octopuses apparently is preferred. That just doesn't roll off the tongue for me. Octopi is frowned upon. Octopodes is frowned upon, apparently, but octopods and octopuses are the most acceptable. So I'm going to go with octopods. There are many, many, many more, and we're going to see a few of those. And I'll try to name as many as I can during the course of this lecture. Not to give you a huge list to know, but just to give you a nice appreciation for the diversity. And so 73,000 is the number I kept finding regarding the actual number of described species. That's the term we're looking for, is described species. 73,000. I got that in a couple of different sources. There are definitive groups out there whose business it is to try to catalog these things and do so well. And so the World Register of Marine Species is one of the more reliable and respected groups where a lot of the data ends up, and they do a good job of putting it together. This article down at the bottom, several French authors, this was in 2016, trying to answer this question. They came up with 73,000 as well. Some other sources say up to 82. And so marinespecies.org, molluscabase.org. All of these are interesting sites if you like taxonomy, if you think that's fun. Okay, and then on top of that, we have a gazillion, not really, 60,000 plus extinct or fossilized species that are that we could add to that list if we're keeping a tally since day one of creation. Our number gets a fair bit larger, as you might expect. And you might expect a lot of the creatures in this group to have gone extinct. In fact, you'd expect a lot of these creatures we've studied thus far this year to have lost a fair bit of diversity during the flood. Of course, these are on the sea floor now. Here, looking at poriferans in particular, and some of the cnidarians, and a lot of these sea floor dwelling organisms, of course, are going to get buried really early on in any type of flood event. Mollusca. Where in the world does this name come from? This is really fabulous stuff here. Aristotle's credited with this term Malakia, which means the soft ones. And so it has roots there in Greek. Molluscus is Latin. Mollusc with a Q-U-E is French. It means the soft ones. They're soft-bodied creatures. And this is a truly soft-bodied creature, one of the more interesting groups of creatures out there, called the nudibranchs, which means naked bodies. Really, they don't have a shell. Nudibranchs, often called sea slugs, and really they've been distinguished from sea slugs a little bit more recently because people have become enamored with these nudibranchs because they're shockingly beautiful. This is really just one example of dozens of remarkably colored organisms. And they have gills on their back, and they're just lovely, lovely creatures. The second largest phylum, as I mentioned, bilateral symmetry. And another kind of fun etymological note, I would love for someone to find out. I did a little research on the etymology here. Malacandra, however you pronounce it, for Lewis Space Trilogy fans, Mars. I want to know if there's a connection here between that, his use of that prefix and this use. We know mal, of course, can mean bad, but I'm just kind of wondering if there's another connection here between the use of that prefix. Regardless, mollusca, phylum Mollusca with a C. When we say mollusk, we put a K on the end just to keep things interesting. General characteristics. They are aquatic, mostly. There are many, many species of land snails. In fact, you read about one earlier this year when you read that article from the Atlantic regarding the last individual snail of a certain species in, I believe it was in Hawaii, and the caretakers kind of first-hand interview with the author. An interesting article for sure. There's lots of land snails, but most are aquatic. Most are aquatic. Most have shells. Most mollusks have shells. Of course, many cephalopods do not. The octopods, I'm going to keep saying that, octopods, the cuttlefish, these creatures do not have shells. Squid do not have shells. This is the only shelled cephalopod, in fact, right here in front of you. We'll talk about the three major classes in a minute. This is a chambered nautilus, and I don't know if I've shown you my nautilus fossil, so let me grab that and show it to you while we've got the nautilus photo up. Here, I'll stop sharing here just for a minute to show you this chambered nautilus. This is actually an ammonite fossil. Ammonite's an extinct group of cephalopods, which are mollusks. And you can see those kind of strange, I'm having trouble thinking of a descriptor here for the shape of these lines. These are chambers. These jagged lines are chambers by which this creature used to capture air to propel itself, right? It's actually able to propel itself. One of the most amazing features of that group is their ability to do jet propulsion. We'll be watching a video about jet propulsion in cephalopods later, but just one example of a shelled mollusk. So most are aquatic, most have shells, and there are many marine and terrestrial species. There are, of course, some freshwater species, not as many as there are ocean or terrestrial species. Okay, let's get into the heart of these creatures, and I'm following from Riot chapter 24, 6 major features I want you to know. This group's so diverse, guys. it's easy to get overwhelmed with how different they are. And so like all of these other taxa, they're not arbitrary. Really, when we talk about a species, it's a unique combination of shared characteristics that define a species, that define a class, a family, an order, a phylum. And so these creatures share 6 characteristics most of the time. And of course, there are a slew of others that we use to separate them into smaller groups. So these are the 6 that all molluscans share. And then we'll look at each class and see how they are kind of variations on that theme of what a mollusk is. So soft-bodied, and that the key and really amazing tissue layer here found in all mollusks is the mantle. And so notice the mantle, it's that dark bold line present along the ridge, which you might assume is the shell of the snail. This is a kind of a cutaway view of a generalized a generalized mollusk, but of course this is looking a lot like a snail compared to other types of mollusks. And so the mantle is that inner tissue layer that actually does the secreting of the shell. This is a remarkable feature. And they do have growth rings. We'll be looking at some clams here later this week. I'll be doing a virtual dissection for you. So the mantle is the tissue layer that grows the shell, secretes that calcium carbonate that's been absorbed, extracted out of the water. And you're going to have a greater diversity in the marine ecosystem because there's a greater supply of the minerals necessary to secrete these types of shells. Okay, they have a mantle, they have a shell. So the mantle, that thin layer right underneath, if you open that clam up, that thin layer is the mantle. And then they have a head foot. Generally speaking, they have a big muscular foot. And that's what the snails move with. That's what the slugs move with. That's what you eat when you eat a clam or an oyster or a scallop. So mantle, shell, and head foot, the first 3 shared features of all molluscans. Second 3 are the mantle cavity. Okay, that means there's a cavity here inside the body. And there is something called the visceral mass or the visceral hump. Those terms are used synonymously. And that means this kind of big layer that surrounds all the internal organs, called the visceral mass. So that's dotted here. It's surrounding the heart, it's surrounding the important digestive features, etc. That's the visceral mass. And then lastly, we have gills or lungs. So notice we went from having almost no real body systems to having true body systems. Several true body systems. And we're getting a hint at a few of those here already. This is a helpful diagram because it really captures several things here. We have a respiratory system with the gills. We have a digestive system that's there in yellow. A complete gut. And we have a circulatory system. And a nervous system. So these little guys are sophisticated. Very much so. And so the list of those right here, specialized tissues and body systems. Specialized tissues and body systems. Complete gut. They don't have to expel waste out the same opening it came in as food. That's a blessing. And so they expel that waste. And they have a circulatory system that could be open or closed. What do you think that means? An open circulatory system. We might have talked about that a little bit. An open circulatory system is one that pumps the blood down these dead-end roads. And those dead-end roads just let the blood leak right out. And then gravity feeds that blood. So the heart is dorsal. Gravity feeds that blood down so it trickles through all of this body cavity. So dorsal heart's really important for this gravity-fed open circulatory system strategy. The blood does make its way back up there after being oxygenated by the gills, and then it happens all over again. So certain groups in this, actually the only creatures in this group that don't have an open circulatory system are the cephalopods. So an open circulatory system means that they leak that blood down into the bottom of that body cavity. It gets drawn back up and pumped to the top and goes through that system all over again. All of these creatures have very sophisticated muscular nervous systems. And of course, again, the octopods being, or the cephalopods being the culmination, the most sophisticated. You watch that video with the octopods. I mean, they're just shockingly amazing. Incredibly intelligent, fine motor control that exceeds our understanding. They are a very, very interesting creature. So, specialized body systems. Digestive system is complete, circulatory system open or closed, and a sophisticated muscular and nervous system. All right, the three major classes. So that was the general overview. Okay, now you're going to just see nothing but differences between these creatures. And that's a good thing. So we know the 6 traits that they all have in common. Again, mantle that grows that shell, the shell itself, the head foot, which you're going to see a variety of, the mantle cavity, that visceral mass, and then a respiratory organ, gills or lungs. Not just direct oxygen exchange anymore, right? There's too many energy needs now. The energy needs are so high that we need to have a more efficient system for getting oxygen to all the cells. And this creature's complex enough that we need bilateral symmetry. So notice we just had a kind of a massive change in organized complexity here. The need for bilateral symmetry, the need for centralized body systems. All right, we're going from city-states to empire. I don't know. Take that analogy as far as you want. I'm sure you can do better with it than me. That's what came to mind. Okay, 3 major classes, and there are others. This is a overview. There are other strange classes that just break our mold apart even further, but these are the major 3, and you're familiar with all of these, at least the creatures in each class: the Bivalvia, the Gastropoda, and the Cephalopoda. So the bivalves, 2 shells, clams, oysters, mussels; the gastropods, the stomach feet, snails, slugs, and nudibranchs; and cephalopods, squids, octopods, I did it again, octopods, and cuttlefish. Okay. Class Bivalvia, second most diverse class. Any of you love being on the beach? I don't know anyone who doesn't. Got to enjoy that time, and collecting shells is one really fun thing to do there at the beach. I have a clam I just got from Winco, the grocery store here, and just to show you it really quickly, this is an interesting group. They don't have a radula. That's one big distinction. They don't have a radula, which I'll explain a radula in a moment. They are these scraping teeth. But here's a nice little Venus clam, I think they were called. These are farm raised. Aquaculture is a really booming industry. We'll be talking about all these different parts, and you can actually see the growth rings right there. It's a nice little clam. Farm raised fish and farm raised mollusks are becoming increasingly popular, successful, etc. I'm not sure this one is, all it said was the US, so I'm not sure where this one was raised, but there are a lot of aquaculture outfits over on the west side. There, actually, Idaho is one of the most advanced aquaculture. Just scratching my nose here for a minute. Advanced aquaculture, as far as amount of fish produced anywhere. Most of the farm-raised trout in the U.S., or a big portion of it's raised in Idaho. This group is also known as the Pelecypods. You can see that muscular foot right here. You can see that calcium carbonate shell. Let's look at a little more internal anatomy, and we're going to do some actual dissection here later this week. We're not going to spend a lot of time here right now, but I just wanted you to get a sense for these creatures. And let's go in reverse order. Let's start with the external anatomy and then go to the internal anatomy. All right, and so practicing your anatomy geography terms, right? We know that anterior means front and posterior means rear. If we hold the clam in the exact same fashion, we line that up and you can see that the anterior side is over here, front, and the posterior side is over here. And this up top is called the umbo. The umbo is this hump where the hinge is. There's a nice look at that muscular hinge. That's a muscle, that dark muscle poking through. Very hard to break through. Okay, that's the dorsal side where the umbo is. So dorsal, and then ventral means belly, and that's where the two shells can be pried open. That's the ventral view of the bivalve. That little Venus clam there. Need to clean off the fingers there. Okay. So, external anatomy, you can see those growth rings quite well. The internal anatomy can be a bit confusing at first when you pry this guy open. Found a couple of good images for you all, and not expecting you guys to sit down and memorize this anatomy. I would like you to know some specific features, and I'll make that clear when we do our virtual or demo dissection. Some of these creatures have much larger siphons that actually stick out of the shell and are difficult to withdraw completely. The Venus clam is not one of those. But notice, here's the mantle, first of all. Let's talk about what we do know. There's the tissue right inside. That secreted the shell. There's the muscular foot. There are the gills, and they really do kind of look feathery like crayfish gills or fish gills. That massive hinge ligament up there. And then the excurrent and incurrent siphon. So these siphons, one draws water in and one pushes it out. Okay, and that's what brings in oxygen, and that's what brings out wastes. It also brings in food. These are filter feeding creatures. And those gills actually help to capture food, and the food can get caught in those gills in the mucus lining, and then that mucus lining tends to eventually drip down, and that food can be captured and absorbed by the mouth and esophagus of the creature, or oftentimes it's simply absorbed kind of intracellularly by the digestive cells in proximity. So incurrent and excurrent siphon. The siphons are much more visible in the cephalopods, you'll see. This is what gives them their ability to use jet propulsion. And so many times clams will orient themselves in the sand or the mud, if you've ever been clam digging, and they'll be oriented like this, and they'll have their siphons that are coming up to the edge of the substrate to bring in water and oxygen and food. And so you might see bubbles coming up as they're doing that when you're looking for a clam to dig up. You find that bubble, you dig down and pop these guys out and cook them up for dinner. So that's the external and internal anatomy of the bivalve. Bivalvia, an important class in Phylum Mollusca. And there's another creature with a much larger siphon, and these are very muscular. You can actually eat. You've probably heard of goose-necked clams or goose-necked barnacles. That's usually referring to this siphon here. And notice gills on the top, very thin, feathery. There are these adductor muscles. Those are the muscles that have to be cut to open the bivalve completely. There's one on each side. And this one actually has a little tiny crab inside that has yet to be digested. Neat. All right, class Bivalvia, remember, has all those same features as the other molluscans, but we do see some interesting differences here, right? The two shells being one of the major differences. Another major difference, no radula, no teeth-like mouth parts for scraping, which you're going to see gastropods and cephalopods have. And these are motile, but they are pretty slow in their movements, and they're not going to be moving nearly as much as some of these others. Now, the gastropods are our next group. The stomach feet, one of my favorite animals on the planet right here is the periwinkle snail. Very, very common creature in all types of coastal ecosystems. It loves the salt marsh. It loves the rocky intertidal zone, the splash zone, there where you see tide pools. These guys are able to move around a fair bit. And this is a very diverse group, the stomach feet, what we think of as the snails or the univalves, right? If a clam is a bivalve, then a snail's got to be a univalve. And we see some interesting gastropods out there, including limpets, chitons, as you saw with our first slide on symmetry, some very amazing shelled creatures. So let's talk about this radula. There's that radula, and they have this really kind of sharp saw blade shape to that radula. It's the internal mouth parts. You don't need to know what all these labeled parts are. This is showing you your typical snail seeing some food and heading over to get a bite very slowly, moving on its mucus membrane. It's placing down this mucus membrane and it's sliding across it. That's how they move, producing the friction. And they then extrude their mouth parts. This almost looks like a chainsaw blade of sorts, and then withdraws that radula. And that motion, that scraping motion, brings the food into its mouth parts, into its esophagus, where it can be brought down to its stomach and digested. This creature's radula has an amazing impact on the substrate that these organisms live in. In fact, if you go to a tide pool, you go to a rocky intertidal zone, there are scrape marks. You can see these scrape marks from limpets, from different types of gastropods that are scraping the algae off the rocks. And so these guys make good use of that algae. Because of our earlier diagrams of the gastropods, I'm not going to spend much more time here at all. Suffice it to say, I'll go back and just show you these other images real quickly. Notice the location of the gills, right? And so some of our gastropods have gills. The fully aquatic marine snails have gills. The terrestrial snails tend to have a lung, also known as a pneumatophore. And if we have a chance, I might show you an illustration or a video that talks about that organ. But for practical purposes, they have a gill or a lung. The gastropods. Many of these creatures also have a door they can close. And so one of their important features to prevent them from drying out is this operculum. They actually close the door, and that prevents any water loss or air getting in. It protects them from predators as well. So they have some remarkable design depending on if they're terrestrial or semi-aquatic or fully aquatic. The last group, and the most shocking and complex, are the cephalopods. So bivalves and gastropods and cephalopods. There's a squid ready to go in the pot or on the hook, whatever your preference. These are amazing, amazing creatures. Look at that eye, quite remarkable. Sense and response mechanism. The cephalopods, the smallest in diversity, but the highest in complexity, that's for sure. Here we see an octopus that's made a home of this clam. It actually will bring this clam along with it as it moves to be able to hide inside if it wants to. These are very, very highly motile. And just think about the number of neurons necessary to keep this creature's 8 arms moving and operating and doing all the things they do. They are the subject of a lot of research, not just in marine biology and physiology programs, but also in the psychology departments. Psychologists have actually become enamored with these octopods because of their sophisticated neural networks and trying to understand their thinking, their thought processes, and their behavior, how they respond to certain stimuli. So these are the head feet. They have this big muscular, really a lot like the cnidarian's bell, this big muscular mantle. And you can see it expand and contract as they move. They're going to be drawing a lot of water in and releasing a lot of water to give them that jet propulsion, both for quickly grasping food, but also for quick escapes. So this group includes the octopods, the cuttlefish, squid. Those are the major cephalopod organisms. And I did a fair bit of research on what really is the difference between these creatures' eyes. Here you see the human eye on the left and the octopus eye on the right. And you've probably heard that this creationists would say that this illustrates that there is a problem with evolutionary theory and the idea of common ancestry, or we wouldn't see this complex of an eye more than once. We see it in octopods, we see it in cuttlefish, we see it in mammals. And we see very complicated eyes in other vertebrates as well. But highlighting humans and highlighting octopods here, we see that they're incredibly similar. So easily the most intelligent invertebrate on the planet, and needing a high bandwidth to be able to process all of the data, all of the sensory data coming in for this organism. And so the major difference here that I've been able to unpack so far is that cephalopods actually move that lens. Their lens will actually move to be able to resolve images, where ours, we simply squint or flex those little tiny ciliary muscles, and that changes the shape of our lens. Our lens changes shape to resolve images. Octopuses actually move their lens to resolve images. So that's one major fundamental difference. Notice also the incredible bandwidth back here in this optical nerve. The other thing that octopuses do with their eye is they can change the shape of the pupil. It can be M-shaped or C-shaped or U-shaped or look like this, and kind of giving you the evil eye. And this, it's theorized. We've been trying to figure out how octopuses can see color, and it's eluded scientists for a long time. They've only found one type of color receptor in the back of the eye, which if they see like we do, that means they wouldn't have color vision. They could only see dark and light and a little bit of blue. We, of course, have red, green, and blue rods and cones that allow us to see those 3 colors and all the thousands of varieties that we get from R, G, and B. For any of you out there into, you know, the pixel world and liquid crystal displays and computer coding and that kind of thing. And so the best that they've been able to come up with so far, the best scientists that have been able to ascertain as to why and how they can see color, is that they're able to change this pupil shape to such a fine degree that allows them to perceive colors physically. The light enters the pupil at different angles, at different frequencies, and that allows them to sense color in a way that doesn't require more than just one color receptor. We're still baffled by this, still trying to wrap our heads around this, still trying to wrap our heads around the neural capacity of these creatures. Some other anatomy here, and we know that these cephalopods have 8 arms. If you're an octopus, you have 8 arms. Cuttlefish and squids have 8 arms plus 2 tentacles. And for cuttlefish especially, they're using those to almost like their front hands, and also to help with some sensory needs. Here's a cutaway view of an octopus internal anatomy, reminding ourselves of the 6 major features that all molluscans have in common. We have the gill here, and you're going to see several gills in an octopus. We see the general mantle cavity and this whole visceral mass surrounding the body, surrounding these internal organs. We also have no shell in cephalopods. There's only one creature with a shell in Cephalopoda, and that's the chambered nautilus that we saw an image of earlier. So mantle cavity, no shell. What are our other ones there? Just remind us here. That muscular head, foot, and gills and lungs. So quite a variation, quite a difference from the bivalve, quite a difference from the Gastropoda. But remember, we're talking about a whole phylum here, right? So that's to be expected. Also notice that this creature has 3 hearts. I'm not sure if all 3 are displayed here. It's got a very sophisticated nervous system and a very sophisticated means of reproduction as well. The male octopus actually uses one of its 8 arms. It's designated to transfer the sperm to the female. He actually places the sperm inside the female with one of his arms. And then she will lay those fertilized eggs, oftentimes keeping them attached to her body and caring for them. And so we see a bit of a quote-unquote maternal instinct here in this creature as well. Okay, other cephalopods. Oh, I remember what I wanted to mention. Also the siphons. So you can see that's labeled here as the funnel. This in-current and ex-current siphon getting that water in and out. Here's the in-current, and then here's the ex-current right there. So the funnel and the anus bringing water in and out for getting rid of waste, for breathing, and then, of course, for jet propulsion. Okay. A couple scary images here. This is very similar to the beak and the radula of the octopus. The only hard part of the creature at all are this beak and radula. And so this scraping, rasping tongue. If you think about a rasp, kind of a file. If you ever use one of those files, it's called like a rat tail file. It's kind of like has these little sharp projections for smoothing some rough surface. This is very similar to the radula. So this is these are chitinous structures. Chitin being what we see in exoskeletons of crabs, lobsters, other arthropods. And look at that beak, horny beak and radula. Pretty scary. Pretty scary mouth parts. Squids have a pen, which is almost like an internal supportive rod of chitin as well. And these have a market for them now. You can buy containers of squid pens. They have been a byproduct for years, no real use for them. People buy squid to eat or to use for fish bait, and the pens aren't really useful. But chitin is becoming an increasingly interesting material. It's a polysaccharide. It's biologically derived and produced in lots of organisms. And apparently it is potentially helpful in wound healing and in the medical industry. So squids have those pens, and they're the only creature in the Cephalopoda that do. They also have an ink sac, as do the octopods and cuttlefish. Squid body plan, quick look here, and mentioning these chromatophores. Chromatophores are these dots all over the outside of the creature, its mantle, its outer sheath, and these are covered in these pigmented, really plastids, right? Kind of like a plastid or vacuole. These pigments are remarkably sophisticated. These creatures can change color in an instant, and so much so that each cell kind of acts like a window, and that it can control the light wavelength that enters, much like its pupil can, and that angle of penetration of the light will show itself in being a different color. And so they seem to have no end to their diversity of colors. So chromatophores are very important in this group, Cephalopoda. So that's the external anatomy of the squid. There's the internal look. You can see the gills, prominent organ there, and some reproductive structures as well. All right, that was a flyby of this phylum Mollusca, guys. Let's just review quickly, remind ourselves of the key features of the bivalves, the gastropods, the cephalopods. They all have these things in common: a mantle that secretes a shell, typically. Not so in the cephalopods. That's the muscular sheath that allows for that contraction that's needed in jet propulsion. The shell, the head foot, which we see in each of these creatures' muscular bodies, mantle cavity, the visceral mass that surrounds the internal organs, and then gills or lungs. And we'll end right here with this diagram that captures all of these features quite well. And you can see the radula there again in this gastropod. This is a really helpful image. Again, highlighting some of those specialized systems as well. Nervous system, circulatory system, muscle system, and that complete digestive system. Okay, guys, that's all we've got. Stay tuned. I'll show you one more thing. I'll show you my oyster as well. Another bivalve. We're going to take a look at the internal anatomy of these later this week. Here's that oyster. Very rough, thick, hard-shelled bivalve here. And so, guys, have a fantastic week. Stay tuned for more on the mollusks. And then next is phylum Echinodermata. Echinodermata, the echinoderms. And look out for their type of symmetry. It's a variation on something that I think you'll be surprised. All right. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.